Alright, how's it going, y'all? So today we're going over Synology's newest feature, which is data tiering, which came out in the DSM 7.3, and it is currently in beta, so your mileage may vary, but I've gone ahead and set it on up and have been testing it out, and it so far works pretty well. Would not recommend using this in a production system, but it is really going to be the answer to a lot of people's goals in the ability to have essentially a really big file server that performs in a lot of ways much like an all SSD high performance file server. What this tiering does is it allows you to combine basically two different Synologies. When I first set this up, I really thought you would be able to do it with essentially all in one Synology. So you'd have an SSD volume and HDD volume, and that is not true. You have to have it on two separate Synologies for whatever reason. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to have a main unit that is the high performance unit. In an ideal world, this would be all SSD, but it could also just be a faster HDD volume. Really, you probably want it on all SSDs, though I could also see this being very useful for people who have an older server that they just kind of want to extend out the storage with. Then you have that tiered out to a secondary Synology that essentially you sign a couple of different rules. We're going to go over all this here. And what it'll do is it will intelligently move files between these two NASs, but your end user only sees one brick of space. What it can do is say things like, hey, if a file has not been modified in 30 days or has not been opened in 30 days, go ahead and transfer it from the hot tier to the cold tier. And it'll do this all outside of business hours, so you really will not see the impact of this going on. Then it will automatically bring those files back to the hot tier if they start being used. I think this could be really useful, and I'm hoping it works well in video editing. I'm still going through that testing process because it does take a while to have everything go cold. But this could allow you to have things like, oh hey, if a project hasn't been opened in a while, it'll just kind of go down into that cold tier, still fully accessible, but it's just in the cold tier. And then if it starts getting used again, it's automatically brought back up to the hot, faster SSD tier, all without your users having to do anything. You can kind of think of this like an SSD cache just on steroids and actually across two different Synologies. There are a couple of restrictions into which Synologies there are. First off, it all has to be on BTRFS volumes, no shock there. And you have to have a somewhat more performant unit as your primary unit, though pretty much all of the Plus models from the 25 series have that. So you should be able to do it if you got one of those units. Though unfortunately, the RS 1221 Plus is on here and the DS 1821 Plus is not on here. They're the exact same unit. They have the same CPU, same specs across the board. The only difference is a rack mount versus not. So it is a shame to see that that is not on there. This is the list as the primary, the fast storage, the hot data. There's also the secondary one, which is the list for the cold data, in which you have significantly more data. So it is pretty open there. We're currently going to be doing this in an RS 2423 RP Plus, and as the cold unit, we're going to have this DS 925 Plus. And there are some just overall limitations, obviously. This is doing a copy in the background, and so some of the other features, like your cloud syncs and your Synology drives, just cannot do this. It does support snapshots, but not replications. We're going to go over all that here. But first, I want to kind of show some of these limitations. So right here, there are a fair amount of limitations here. Hyper backup, really you should not be restoring this unless you're restoring both of them at the exact same time, just because otherwise you're going to get inconsistent data. For snapshot replication, you cannot replicate them. So you cannot be using this as a replication. Obviously the data is kind of jumbled. It's no longer just a clean BTRFS snapshot. But it does actually support snapshots, and it actually takes a snapshot on both systems at the exact same time. And so you do get that point in time consistency. Interestingly enough, you cannot do data scrubbing for tiered files, but it does have its own data integrity check. You can use universal search, but when you index it, it will pretty much bring the vast majority of files back on up to the hot tier. I guess I don't see documents in there, but PDFs do. So there is some still limitations there. You also cannot use ext4 external drives. You cannot use Synology Drive with this, understandable. And you also cannot use this for download station or container manager or cloud sync. So there are a fair amount of limitations to this. Really, it is just for very specific workflows, which I think makes sense to most people. There's only so many things you can do there. And you do also have to be updated to DSM 7.3. It'll also allow you to do it with a 1 gigabit connection, though it says here 10 gigabit is obviously preferred, really depending on what your setup here is. So the way this actually works is it's a lot more of a file-based tiering than a block-based tiering, if that makes sense. It is actually a bot basically going in on there, looking at modification times and sending files back and forth based off of it. And you actually define a schedule for when you'd like it to occur. And so that process does differ from block-based stuff, where it's done very much more automatically. This is very much, there is a script running that basically detects the files, moves them over, and essentially is constantly in charge of synchronizing them across the two. And it actually does work without having you delete your old volume. I was really concerned that you were going to have to blow away the old volume, but we'll show here it does not require you to. So that is the overall specifications. Let's go in and actually see the nitty gritty of all this stuff and see how it works. What I've gone ahead and done is I have installed the Synology tiering on my RS2423, and on my DS925 Plus, I have installed the tiering vault. So pretty much the primary, you install tiering, and the secondary, you install tiering vault. Pretty simple overall. They are currently in beta, and currently it only supports tiering 1-to-1. So you can't have 3 different cold storages. Instead, you can only have 1 cold storage, 1 hot storage, which does make sense. And it's actually remarkably easy to set up. I'm going to go ahead and open up my RS2423. Just open up that Synology tiering app, and we're just going to set up a tiering plan. All you do is you just say what the cold tier is, that you've got that app installed. There's some firewall ports if you're going cross network, but you probably shouldn't. And you just go ahead and sign on in. You have to sign in with an administrator account on the secondary volume, and that's pretty much it. And then you just choose what volume to go on. I only have the 1 volume here, but you could choose whatever. And now you just choose what shared folder to be tiered. It is kind of remarkably easy. And we now get to write out our policy. The way this works is you will be able to say, hey, I want files that have not been accessed for over X number of days to be tiered on down, or you can say not modified. Really depends on your workflow, and you can also combine these two, totally up to you. The other thing it will always do is it's got a failsafe in here. So you actually specify a certain amount of capacity you would like, and if you're reaching that capacity edge, it'll automatically start tiering stuff down no matter what. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna say, hey, anything that's not been accessed in 15 days, go ahead and send on down to the cold storage, and you can tweak these after the fact. Then you just go ahead and give it a super simple schedule. So the blue is times that stuff will be tiered on out, and the white is stuff that will not be tiered. So obviously this does have a performance impact, so you probably want to do it outside of business hours. And depending on what you're doing, you probably can get away with something like this. The tiering process is pretty darn quick, so you don't need that many hours. So I would probably say it makes more sense to be a little bit more open with it rather than really, really refined. Then right here, you can choose how often you'd like it to run its own integrity check. What this will do is this will do a deep scan of these files and make sure nothing weird has happened. It's really good that they have this. This is one of those things that is a bit dangerous of a process. This is not like a BTRFS snapshot replication where nothing can go wrong because it's sending over atomic blocks of data. Rather here, it is running off of scripts, and if things crash at the wrong time, stuff might not be perfectly copied over. And so having a failback of something like this to make sure everything's good is really key. Reading through their documentation, they actually do have a system where they're making sure that the primary storage keeps a copy of the data for a certain amount of time before sending on over. And that's pretty much it. Now, if we log into the 25 model, we will see that we actually see this as a folder right here. It is not recommended you touch anything in here, but you actually kind of see your storage over there. To make this more interesting, and it will take a minute, you can hit this button that says tier now, and it will automatically start the tiering process on over. Otherwise, it would have waited for the 14 hours, and basically that schedule I showed. We can see that now, because there is already stuff in that existing folder, it is starting to copy that over onto the DS 925 Plus, and it even shows you the files in plain text here. Now, this is where it's doing file by file, and so neither one of these has a complete data set. Really, you have to have both of them together to see all your files, but you do actually have each file in its own place, and especially if something does go wrong, you can kind of piecemeal recover depending on the situation, though obviously that is not preferred. While it's running through, we can also see some of our settings, and this right here is where we can go ahead and say, hey, if the certain capacity is reached, so if the volume starts getting too low, tier immediately. And I'm gonna say 750 gigabytes for about half my space because I want this to actually tier early. We'll just do a terabyte. So this is where we can test out some of its automatic tiering things, but this is especially useful if you want to be able to have a huge influx of files come in. You want to make sure you've always got that space free to make sure it doesn't have to start tiering halfway through the import and having issues like that. That'll just really kill your performance. So making sure that you always have a certain amount of space free is great to have there. Really, this is very complex for planning out your workflows, and you need to spend some time understanding it to do it. Another thing to mention, if you're familiar with the record file access functionality that we always disable, the Synology tiering record file access time is independent of this one. So you can leave this off and it is not a big deal. All right, so that tiering has successfully completed. And so we can see about half and half have moved on over. While we're at it, let's also just go in and test out some snapshots. So I'm gonna go ahead and set up a standard snapshot schedule here. I really like the new rules, by the way. And so we can actually see that a corresponding schedule will be created on this side over here. So we go ahead and take the snapshot. We will see that there is a snapshot taken on this side as well. So it does still take the snapshots on both sides. And this is actually one thing to really focus on now. Previously with snapshots, they pretty much never took up any space unless you're actively deleting files. Now you have to realize that when these things tier, they could start taking up extra space because of the way snapshots work. So you do lose some of your brilliant snapshot efficiency with it. And so there is an article about making sure it works. I do need to do some more testing with that, but I would say in general, you're going to have to be a little less aggressive with your snapshot policy, unfortunately, if you are using this tiered system, because your primary volume will not necessarily get you your space back depending on the snapshot schedules. So pulling up this article really quick, and you can see right here that snapshots by their nature will hold on to those files. So this is a con. I think for a lot of people, they will find a workaround and make it worth it, but it does mean that you lose some of the really nice capability that snapshots give you whenever you're looking at tiering data. So we'll definitely have to investigate some more best practices for snapshots with regard to tiering. All right, so now let's go ahead and connect to this thing and just see how it works. So I've just gone ahead and connected to it via SMB, and we're just going to mount this drive. And we can see right here, we still do see our snapshot folder, and we can see everything in there, and it appears to work very normally. You can see I did do this snapshot before I actually started the replication. So let's just go ahead and see how much space is actually used. And we can see that the snapshots are still taking up that space. So this is one of those things where with that tiering process, the snapshots have not had a chance to reclaim the space because we still have that snapshot. It's very useful, but also something to be wary of. You do have to really cut down on your retention policies because data will not be completely brought out of your volume until that snapshot process has completed. If you're looking for write-heavy workflow, it's not too big of a deal, but especially if you're looking at a read-heavy workflow, you may only be able to take snapshots for a short amount of time or find another backup solution for retention of files. You're going to have to test it with your workflows. But we can see overall, we just have our files, and this right here is a Final Cut Pro volume. And part of it's going to be on the actual regular volume, and part of it's on the cold storage. So let's go ahead and see what happens here. Nothing. Everything appears to just be running just as it should be. I cannot tell whatsoever. And I'm going to look at and see how much data is flowing out of the other unit, and it does not seem to be much at all. So let's see if I can start pulling some of those files that did get tiered. So I'm going to go ahead and just go directly to one of the files that appears to be in there. And this one right here, according to this, should be on the actual tiered storage. We'll just see what happens when we copy it over. Nothing. And so we can see right there that there is that effect. Right now, because of the way tiering works, this file is still stored on this unit right here. It actually is set so it stays in there for at least 10 more minutes. So that way, it's got basically a period of about 10 minutes before it will release the space. I'm going to go ahead and to test this on out, I'm going to delete all of our snapshots. All right, so right now I'm just copying over some massive data over, and we can also actually see where it will show us what tier some files are on. We can come in, and it is not exposed over SMB. Obviously, there's no way to do this, but we can see right here, it'll show you if it's hot or if it's cold. Now, it would be useful, I think, in sometimes to be able to manually move files around. I go back and forth on if that would be useful. I could see that being very useful on a folder level, just be able to forcibly say, I need all of my hot data right now, but there is always that kind of other option. And if we look at it right here, this data should be under the cold tier. I'm going to look at the cold tier that should have it, and we're going to try to copy it on over. We can see that it is copying on over, and let's see what kind of performance we get out of it. And we actually peaked out pretty quickly. So even on this unit, it was a very short copy, especially given the fact that it took a while to go. So we can see right there that the actual process was decently quick. So in this process, I'm copying over the total storage amount that I have set it to automatically start tiering. So this is where we can say, hey, if the available capacity of a certain volume is under a following limit, which it should be quite shortly, we're going to see it start manually tiering stuff on over, which I am very interested to see. Okay, so now all of our files have copied on over, and we are officially above the tiering capacity limitation. We now are going to get this thing to manually trigger the tiering. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we are going to go ahead and hit this action tier now. And what it's going to do is it should start copying files on over to that secondary system to make sure that our storage stays under 1.4 terabytes of free space. Because this tiering process, kind of by design, is meant to only happen outside of working hours, you do need to be a little particular with this. If you are somebody who will copy 10 times the SSD space to this volume, you may run into some issues. So now what this process is doing is we are moving files on over to our secondary system, and we can see right here we're more or less saturating that 2.5 gigabit connection to this system, and overall it's seeming fairly seamless. I actually want to check out and see what happens if I try to open this volume while this is going. I want to try editing some stuff here. So if you did have a mid-session tier or whatever was going on, what kind of processes would you go through? And I just got to relink some media. And so far, other than the fact that I don't have this LUT on there, all the tiering appears to be working seamlessly. Even while this tiering is going on, I've not had any issues actually running the system. It's all performing quite well. Maybe there's a performance impact on it, but it seems like it actually manages itself very well. One thing I am slightly worried about that I do wish it would have a little bit better of a job is, I wish if you started getting a lot closer to the volume capacity threshold or exceeding it, it would automatically start that tiering process mid-workday. This could have its own pros and cons, certainly, but I do think that would be very useful to have, especially for those video production houses who might absolutely slam the NAS with a ton of space. One other thing to be aware of that is another limitation is the maximum file size. You can only have up to a 1 terabyte file in this system. If you try to copy a 3 terabyte file, it just won't work. There's not a lot of files that are actually that large. 1 terabyte I don't think will impact very many people, but that is a limitation depending on your workloads. The other thing I do wish they had the ability to do was just a recursive tier. So you could say, hey, pull all of this stuff on over ASAP. I want this entire folder brought back on up. And I know it is a manual process in that, and the idea here is it should be very automatic, but it would be great to have. All right, so now the last thing I want to go ahead and do is I want to test out what happens with a failure. I'm going to go ahead and just pull the drive, and I want to see what happens whenever this goes on. So I've just pulled the power from this system, and so we should get a bad setup for the actual tier. So I pulled the power out halfway through a tier. And when I did that, pretty much no files will open. The file system is there, but they will not open. It still says healthy. This is still in a beta, so I'm sure they will update that notice. But let's go ahead and just see what happens if we try to power on up. I would imagine this is the worst possible case scenario. Copying files to it, and I was manually setting the tiering going on right then. So let's just see what happens. So interestingly enough, we still have not gotten any error messages on the tiering side of things. And all we're really noticing is that files just do not open. They're still in the file tree, but they just do not open. Though I appear to be able to download them directly from the actual web interface, which does make sense. All right, so it just came right back on up. We did throw an error, which is to be expected. But it does appear to just have relinked very cleanly. All things considered, especially for beta, this seemed to have worked out quite nicely. Now, especially if I was modifying a ton of files, you never know what kind of corruption you can get. The way this process does work is it's a very safe process, according to their documentation at least, whereas essentially copying the file over, verifying everything, and then updating it and keeping it still for about 10 minutes on both sides. So with all that, everything seems to have run. There's also a lot more fine-grained control than I would have expected. You can actually schedule exactly when the tiering occurs, even manually run it. And it did seem to not really even miss a beat when I pulled that power cord out. Everything just came right back up on running without having any key issues that I've seen so far. So overall, I think tiering could be really useful for a lot of deployments. The biggest thing is just getting it tuned exactly for your workflow and making sure that you always have enough capacity in this faster model for having things like a massive ingest occur that may mean that you need to tier more often than you expect to, which does also limit how useful it is. But with the simple ability to manually run a tier, I do think that is quite useful. So if you know you're having that case running, you can manually tier halfway through the day, and so you do keep your space going without having a huge amount of issues. All right, well that's going to be it for this tiering overview. Leave any questions you've got for me down in the comments below. If you want to hire me, there's a link for that down in the description below. And have a good one. Bye.